$14,200,000 has disappeared from Ferris Creston's accounts, Zola, and every wire transfer record on this table carries your foundation's name. Caden Wyndham, 42-year-old Chief Financial Officer of Ferris Creston Developments and husband of Zola, dropped a thick folder onto the boardroom table. The room was cold. The chairs had been arranged in a deliberate horseshoe, and Zola Wyndham Osei, 36-year-old Executive Director of the Osei Heritage Foundation and wife of Caden, had been placed at one end of it, separated from the rest, beneath the ceiling's brightest overhead panel. No one had poured her water. Phoebe Strand, 34-year-old Director of Corporate Acquisitions at Ferris Creston Developments and Caden's mistress, sat in the chair that had always been left for Zola during family board reviews. She had already arranged her folders. She looked entirely comfortable. Inside the document package were fabricated transfer records, falsified vendor registrations, and correspondence bearing Zola's name, written in a style she did not recognize, referencing transactions she had never authorized. One vendor had been incorporated under the name Zola Heritage Outreach Inc., designed to appear connected to her real charity. The records claimed she had redirected capital from Ferris Creston's acquisition fund into her own programs. Bertrice Wyndham, 65-year-old matriarch of the Wyndham family and Caden's mother, studied Zola from across the table. "You spent 9 years convincing this family that you had nothing to gain," she said. "Now we know what you were actually waiting for." Zola looked at her husband. "You know these records don't reflect anything I did." Caden glanced away. Osmond Wyndham, 69-year-old founder and chairman of Ferris Creston Developments, sat at the head of the table with his jaw set. 2 company directors sat beside him, people Caden had invited not to discover the truth, but to make the accusation appear official before witnesses. Bram Finch, 56-year-old family solicitor for the Wyndhams, produced a second folder. He placed 3 documents in front of Zola. The first was a signed divorce petition bearing Caden's signature. The second was an acknowledgement of service. The third was a proposed settlement requiring her to leave the matrimonial home, waive all financial claims, accept responsibility for the missing funds, and agree to a media silence clause restricting what she could say about the Wyndham family publicly. Caden pushed a pen across the table. "Sign everything. Make this simpler." Zola read each page without hurrying. She signed the acknowledgement confirming she had received the petition. She signed a separate consent agreeing the marriage should be dissolved. Then she returned the settlement unsigned and placed the pen precisely on top of it. "I'll sign to end this marriage," she said. "I won't sign your lie, surrender what's mine, or confess to a theft you invented." Caden mistook her stillness for surrender. He nodded toward Garrick Toll, 46-year-old head of Ferris Creston Building Security. Garrick approached Zola's bag. She had set it briefly at the reception desk when she arrived. Juniper Wyndham, 28-year-old communications director at Ferris Creston and Caden's younger sister, had watched Phoebe enter the reception area alone during that interval. Juniper had not said a word. Her mother was watching her from across the room. Garrick emptied the bag onto the table. A slim black USB drive fell out among Zola's foundation ID, her wallet and her keys. Phoebe spoke before anyone else could. "That's the backup drive. It holds the diverted ledgers." Zola looked directly at her. "No one has opened it. How would you know what's on it?" For a half-second, Phoebe's composure slipped. Then she recovered. "It matches a company security issue we've been tracking." Before Zola could continue, the boardroom doors opened. Detective Irina Stoke, 43-year-old financial crimes investigator with the Calgary Police Service, entered with 2 officers and a warrant. Caden had filed the criminal complaint 6 days earlier and arranged this meeting after he already knew the arrest was coming. He had placed Zola in this room so she would look guilty in front of witnesses before the officers arrived. Kweku Danso, 51-year-old legal advisor to Zola's family trust, entered directly behind the officers and identified himself as her counsel. Zola looked toward him. "Contact Rosamond," she said quietly. "Preserve every Ferris Creston login, every physical token, every transfer record connected to those accounts. Independent review only. I'm recused from all of it." Caden heard the instruction and assumed she was improvising. He reached for Phoebe's hand as the officers moved toward Zola. That choice ended the last thing Zola had still been protecting inside herself. She had not known, when she accepted Caden's call 3 weeks earlier, that she was already being framed. The crisis had started on a Tuesday morning. Ferris Creston's payroll release failed at 11:52 a.m. Across the company's construction yards and administrative offices in Calgary, Edmonton, and Red Deer, workers waited for wages that did not arrive. The phones rang without stopping. One woman called the payroll desk, asking whether her direct deposit would clear by Thursday. She was behind on her gas bill, and the province's utility assistance program had a deadline. Caden called Zola while she was mid-address at the OC Heritage Foundation's annual scholarship ceremony. Her late mother, Amara OC, had personally funded the first cohort of those scholarships. Zola had been speaking about her for 7 minutes when the phone vibrated. "The payroll model you rebuilt last quarter is failing again," Caden said. He did not say hello. "If your speech can wait, come and be useful." Behind her, 14 scholarship recipients sat in their seats. "How many workers are affected?" she asked. "All of them. Every site." "I'm coming." She handed her notes to Bridget Tulo, 42-year-old senior program manager of the OC Heritage Foundation, and asked her to complete the ceremony. "Give every student their award. Tell them I'll meet them personally this week." She left because payroll was not a number. It was rent and groceries and someone's heat staying on through an Alberta winter. 20 minutes later, she sat in Ferris Creston's financial operations room and worked through the cause. Within the first hour, she found 3 problems. Income that hadn't been received yet had been counted as already available. Short-term liabilities had been excluded from the credit calculation, and several $1 million had flowed through entities described only as strategic consultants. One of those entities was named Zola Heritage Outreach Inc. She paused on that name. Orrin Pike, 48-year-old company controller and Caden's closest internal ally, noticed where she had stopped. "Corporate lending involves layers that charity administration doesn't typically require," he offered. "Hiding a liability doesn't make a company stronger," Zola replied. "It only delays the day someone asks where the money went." She rebuilt the report. A junior treasury analyst checked her figures and nodded. Caden dismissed the room before anyone could say more about who had found the error. Payroll was released at 4:47 that afternoon. When Caden addressed the floor staff, he described the resolution as the result of his own negotiations with Holloway. Sylvette Morin, 54-year-old payroll administrator who had worked at Ferris Creston for 26 years, thanked him with visible relief. She had been afraid to mention that her own wages were stretched that month. She was caring for her elderly father, and the costs had been quietly accumulating. Zola watched through the glass from the empty hallway. Juniper looked from her brother back to Zola and said nothing, but she understood whose work had actually protected those deposits. Zola told herself that love didn't require public credit, but Caden had begun treating her silence as proof that she had never contributed anything worth recognizing. She had known who she was long before she fully understood what it meant to carry that quietly. Her father, Edwin O.C. Barrow, had founded Holloway Private Capital from a single Calgary office in the 1980s. By the time Zola was 12, the institution had grown into one of Western Canada's most respected private investment firms, managing corporate accounts, syndicated loans, and commercial credit across 3 provinces. Edwin never raised his daughter to perform wealth. He brought her to client dispute hearings, loan adjudication rooms, and regulatory reviews, insisting she understand the weight of what the institution held. "Every balance sheet connects to someone's livelihood," he told her once, placing a photograph of a construction crew beside a debt service table she was studying. "When numbers are manipulated, the people at the bottom pay first." She was 14 when a business publication named her as Edwin's only heir. Within 2 weeks, 2 men attempted to force her into a vehicle outside her school in the Ramsey neighborhood. Her mother, Amara, placed herself between them and her daughter. Amara was injured before bystanders intervened, but she did not release Zola's hand. Edwin removed Zola from all public succession documentation that same month. She began using her mother's surname. The Barrow OC Legacy Trust was restructured through several holding vehicles known only to a narrow group of trustees, senior officers, and regulators. Zola learned to live without displaying what she owned. Amara died of cancer when Zola was 29. Zola kept the name OC because it carried the memory of the woman who had once stood in the path of strangers to keep her safe. Before marrying Caden, she disclosed that she held a protected premarital trust. He signed the agreement without reviewing the attached disclosure. He assumed it held modest property and some family investments. She had never told him a direct lie. The trust's restrictions had required disclosure confidentiality until a specific succession date, and she had told herself she would explain everything once that date passed. Once she could be certain he was the man she had married, not someone who had simply been patient. The restriction had expired 6 weeks before the payroll crisis. She had been carrying a sealed letter for him in her bag the evening she arrived at the Wyndham family home for what Bertrice had described as an urgent family discussion. She thought it was about the marriage. She believed something between them was still worth one honest conversation. She found out differently when she heard voices in Caden's private study. Phoebe was in his arms. One hand rested inside his jacket. He was wearing the watch Zola had saved for across 2 months because she had wanted it to mean something. She would have left without a word, but a sentence kept her in the doorway. Once she's charged, Phoebe said, Holloway's review committee will link the missing money to her and close the file. Heiress Creston keeps its credit facility intact. The family already sees her as an outsider who married into something she doesn't understand. Caden answered. They'll accept whatever I place in front of them. The affair and the missing money were not separate problems. They were one plan. From the doorway, she could see copies of her passport on his desk, photocopied signature cards from an old foundation grant form, and a folder labeled with the shell company name. She photographed what was visible before Caden noticed her reflection in the darkened window glass. He stepped back from Phoebe but did not look ashamed. The marriage was already over, he said. You just refused to acknowledge it. Zola left without giving him the truth he had not earned. She met Kweku that evening. He told her to preserve all communications, change the Foundation's system credentials, document every missing identity record, and route the photographs through an encrypted channel. He also warned her not to face the Wyndham family alone. They may be preparing more than a divorce filing, he said. She returned home only to collect what she needed. Phoebe arrived while she was still there, using a key, carrying an overnight bag. She walked directly to Caden's study without asking where it was. Around Phoebe's neck was the coral pendant Zola's mother had brought back from a trip to Nova Scotia years before the diagnosis, the one Zola kept in a closed jewelry case in the bedroom. Take that off. Phoebe touched it. Caden gave it to me. He said it didn't really suit you. Zola took it back without another word and walked out of the house where she had lived for 9 years. On the drive to meet Kweku, a secure message arrived from Rosamund Vale, 57-year-old Chief Compliance Officer of Holloway Private Capital and one of Edwin's most trusted former colleagues. The USB drive recovered in a company's security log had been purchased through a purchase Phoebe had authorized. Rosamund advised Zola not to touch any device the Wyndham family presented to her. The meeting scheduled for the following evening was not an opportunity to repair the marriage. Someone had already designed a seat for Zola at that table, and it was not the seat of a wife. The days after her release moved quickly in some ways and not at all in others. Caden had expected her to negotiate from fear. She did not call him. Filed her formal divorce response through proper channels, confirming she consented to dissolution of the marriage but had never accepted the proposed settlement or any of its allegations. Her civil claims, defamation, identity fraud, coercion, conspiracy were preserved separately. Inside Holloway's secure forensic suite, Yusuf Eni, 46-year-old independent forensic accountant retained by the bank's compliance team, reconstructed the transfer chain. Caden's physical security token had authorized the second payment, initiated while Zola was seated in a room surrounded by family witnesses. Phoebe's administrative credentials had altered the beneficiary information. The USB drive's purchase record traced to the same order Phoebe had signed. The shell company's email account had been created from Heiress Creston's executive floor. A cloned device had simulated Zola's home network connection. A laptop that hadn't actually connected to that network in over 4 months. Juniper, who had seen Phoebe enter the reception area the day of the board meeting, had stayed silent. Her mother had gripped her wrist beneath the table. One sentence could destroy this family, Beatrice had whispered. But Juniper had sat alone that night and thought about the year Beatrice blamed her publicly for a failed company communications campaign. Zola had quietly absorbed part of that criticism to stop Osmond from removing Juniper from her role. Zola had protected her when silence would have cost nothing. Using an anonymous channel, Juniper sent Kweku her evidence. A photograph of Phoebe handling Zola's passport copies inside the house, internal messages confirming the public statement accusing Zola had been drafted 3 days before the board meeting, and a timestamp showing the arrest warrant had already been issued when Caden sent the invitation. Detective Stoke received the materials through proper evidence procedure and requested a second meeting with Yusuf's team. Then Phoebe found a document in Caden's locked desk drawer, a folder labeled Strand Authorization Record. It described her as the sole initiator of the false vendors and the sole handler of Zola's identity documents. No mention of Caden's direction anywhere in the document. He had written a contingency before the first version of his plan had even been tested. Phoebe photographed every page, returned the originals, and contacted her own defense solicitor before morning. Caden arrived at Holloway's offices for a restructuring review he had personally requested, fully expecting the institution to honor 15 years of client history. He entered the largest boardroom carrying his security token and a contract he intended to finalize. He did not yet know who was waiting. The account screen turned red before he could open his folder. Executive authority suspended, transaction under independent fraud review, credit facility and material default review, contact independent corporate counsel. He tried a second account, the same message. He tried the reserve account, rejected. He demanded to speak with Holloway's senior management immediately. Archibald Kwan, 67-year-old independent chairman of Holloway Private Capital and a former business partner of Edwin O.C. Barrow, sat at the head of the table. He had known Zola since she was 11. "Bring me whoever authorized this review," Caden said. "Whoever controls this institution needs to understand what Ferris Creston represents to this bank." Archibald glanced toward the boardroom doors. "The controlling beneficiary of this institution requested a fully independent review and recused herself from every decision you are now challenging," he said. The doors opened. Zola entered with Kweku and Rosamond. She wore her father's watch. She did not smile at the man who had taken Phoebe's hand while the officers secured her own. Archibald rose from his chair. The independent directors rose with him. "Zola Wyndham O.C. Barrow," he said, "controlling beneficiary of the Barrow O.C. Legacy Trust and principal shareholder of Holloway Private Capital." Caden's color left his face entirely. He looked at her the way a man looks at a wall he has walked directly into, not with understanding, but with the blank shock of impact. Osmond, who had attended a conference where Edwin O.C. Barrow spoke in 1997, looked between Zola and Archibald. "You're Edwin's daughter," he said. "Yes." Yusuf presented the complete forensic reconstruction. Caden's token approval of the second transfer, made while Zola sat in a witnessed room. Phoebe's credential manipulation, the cloned home network device, the copied signature lifted from an old foundation grant form, the USB drive's purchase record, the public statement written 3 days before any evidence was supposedly discovered, and then, where the money had actually gone, into a private property Caden had arranged with Phoebe, into luxury travel, into debt repayments for Oren, whose gambling losses had been part of the arrangement from the beginning. Caden stared at the screen for a long moment. "You hid who you were." Zola sat beside Kweku without looking away. "I told you before our marriage that I held a protected family trust. I disclosed that a confidentiality restriction prevented full transparency until a specific date. You signed the agreement without reading the attached disclosure." She paused. "I concealed the scale of an inheritance. You fabricated a crime and used the legal system to imprison an innocent person. Those are not the same betrayal." Caden had no answer. The independent board voted to suspend Ferris Creston's executive authorization access. Caden, Phoebe, and Oren lost account credentials. The credit facility was placed under default review. Payroll accounts and essential supplier payments remained fully protected under separate safeguards already secured through court authority. Osmond's restructuring committee was given power to appoint temporary independent financial supervision. Before leaving the room, Zola submitted one written request to the independent directors: protect Sylvette Moran's wages and every worker on every Ferris Creston site. They did not make this choice. The committee honored it without qualification. The criminal charges were dismissed 6 weeks later. The forensic record was formally corrected. Zola's civil claims moved forward through proper channels. Her belongings were returned. Foundation sponsors came back, some with apologies, some with sizable donations and new interest in her profile. She declined any support offered because the donor wanted proximity to Holloway or to the O.C. Barrow name. She accepted only contributions tied to real, transparent programs. Bridget helped her expand the foundation's mission. A new initiative provided legal assistance for people whose identities had been used to construct false financial crimes. Another offered emergency support to workers affected by executive fraud at the companies that employed them. Scholarships were opened for women entering forensic accounting, financial compliance, and corporate law. Caden entered a guilty plea to several fraud and obstruction charges the following spring. Phoebe's partial cooperation reduced her exposure but could not restore what she had dismantled. Oren lost his professional standing and faced separate proceedings. Bertrice came to Kweku's office seeking Zola. Her voice was unsteady. "If I had known you were Edwin's daughter, I would never have treated you the way I did." Zola considered the words. "The woman you treated that way deserved fairness before you knew what she owned." Bertrice lowered her eyes and said nothing further. Juniper came separately and without an agenda. I watched them walk you out of that room, she said quietly. I had the photograph on my phone. I waited a week before I sent it. You sent it, Zola said. Too late. Late courage still matters, Zola told her. But it doesn't cancel the price someone else paid while you were deciding. Juniper accepted the answer without trying to argue past it. At the OC Heritage Foundation's first ceremony under the expanded mandate, Zola stood in a dining hall filled with students, work, scholarship recipients, and families the foundation had supported across the years. Every chair was occupied. No one had repositioned hers. No one had searched her bag at the door. An untouched plate waited in front of her. Untouched because Brigid had asked everyone to pause while Zola signed the new program charter. The pen she held was the same kind that Bram Finch had placed across the boardroom table and invited her to use against herself. That evening, she signed her real name across the founding document of something she had built to protect people who had no one with the standing to hear them. The room filled with applause she had not asked for and did not need. Before sunrise the following morning, she walked through Holloway's operations floor alone. Staff were preparing routine disbursements, portfolio summaries, and ordinary account transfers. Nothing about the room announced itself. The lights were plain. The work was plain, that was the point. Truth had not undone Caden through spectacle or retaliation. It had moved through preserved timestamps, independent review, authorization logs, and two people, Juniper and Rosamond, who had eventually chosen accuracy over loyalty to a version of events that had never been real. Across the city, in a detention facility processing his sentencing paperwork, Caden sat before printed copies of the transfer records he had arranged to make Zola appear guilty. Every falsified vendor entry remained visible. Every payment trail leading back to him and Phoebe remained visible. The accounts had never been Zola's instrument. They were witnesses. They had simply been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. He had framed his wife because he believed she was small enough to sacrifice. He lost his marriage, his position, his access, his mistress, and ultimately his freedom because he had spent 9 years mistaking her composure for limitation. The morning light moved across Holloway's windows. Zola walked toward it without lowering her face or concealing her name. On her desk, beside her father's watch and the now-closed anniversary letter she had once prepared for Caden, lay a new referral file. In plain handwriting across the cover were the words, "Urgent. Client falsely implicated through manipulated payroll records. Requires immediate legal review." She pulled her chair in and opened the first page. Her marriage had ended. Her hiding had ended. But the truth had already found the next person who needed someone with the standing and the patience to listen.